Authorities in the Philippines are warning that a volcano near the capital could be on the verge of a dangerous eruption. Well, the
raging off California's pristine coastline, it wasn't the size, but the sheer power of this volatile wildfire that caught even veteran firefighters by surprise.
We start with the unfolding humanitarian crisis.
The
UN says the region is experiencing its worst drought in 4 decades. The problem is compounded by a lack of humanitarian aid. As a result, millions face famine in parts of Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and Djibouti. The ongoing war in Ukraine is further worsening the already worrying situation.
It's just the opening act of what could be one of nature's most dramatic shows. The Taal volcano last erupted more than 40 years ago. Now as steam rushes above and earthquakes rumble below, expect to see another massive eruption in just hours away.
Then engulfing sprawling properties.
We were afraid and panicked. We were thinking of how we could save our lives.
We were walking and walking.
Tens of thousands of people living in nearby towns have been evacuated. Rain mixed treacherous.
It's difficult to get food because we can't use the vehicle since it's muddy, and we can't even clean it since there's no water.
The extent of the damage is still unclear.
Ash is affecting the capital, Manila, 60 kilometers north. Face masks are in short supply. At the airport, hundreds of flights have been cancelled. While some tourists are trying to leave, others are getting up close to the volcano.
California's beauty and Mother Nature's fury collided in a fast-moving fire to a home. But
Without the support of her relatives, they wouldn't survive, she says.
The danger level has now reached level 4, just one notch away from a hazardous eruption. Which could affect hundreds of thousands of people living in the volcano's danger zone.
Days ahead of them. They are concerned that the weather here could also take a turn over the next 24 to 48 hours, so it will still be...
All life on Earth, from the ecosystem to human civilization, is vulnerable to our changing climate. Unprecedented changes to the climate have already affected all forms of life in every part of the world. We have seen how species and ecosystems respond to climate change and if they can adapt or not, the implications this has for nature and people, and how climate change affects our life-sustaining resource, water. We see its risks to food security from changes to crop yields, fruit harvest, livestock, and fisheries, and how we lack to manage them. People living in cities and rural areas, building key infrastructures, risk living in harmony with nature, which only provides them support to a certain extent. Climate change affects our health and well-being, and communities around the globe have yet to be transformed and strengthened to reduce high risks and losses for the most vulnerable. Our future climate depends on what we do, how we live our lives, and how we can safeguard nature and people, starting now and involving everyone. Because our climate is our future, and every second matters. The stakes for our planet have never been higher. We will be reaching our limit of the planet's 1.5 degrees Celsius increase within the next decade. These are the consequences of inaction. The main question becomes, how should we think about the wrong that we are doing? Peter Singer says that we should think of it as an extremely serious injustice. The consequences of climate change are extremely unjust for future generations, and they know it. Climate change is at least as serious a wrong as colonization, for we are taking something that is a common resource, using it as our benefit and really as our luxury, because most of what we use up is not part of our necessities. And in order to support this luxurious lifestyle, we are imposing huge costs both on present generations and much more on future ones. So we are doing a huge injustice to those who are defenseless because they don't even exist yet. We are doing things that are very serious. We are changing rainfall patterns, which means that farmers will no longer be able to farm the lands that they've always lived on. They will become refugees or they will even die. We are causing sea levels to rise, which will affect us, but more so those tens of millions of people living in the low-lying delta regions of Egypt or Bangladesh, where they farm fertile lands, which will be invaded by rising waters. This is an enormous wrong that we are doing, that we know that we are doing. We've known it without any real shadow of doubt that we are doing it, and yet we are continuing to do so. Climate change is a grave threat to our well-being and a healthy planet. Our actions today will shape how people will be able to adapt to climate change and how nature responds to increasing climate risks. The vulnerable and the most marginalized are the most exposed to climate change impacts and have the least resources to adapt. According to the IPCC 2022 report on Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability, which assesses the complex interaction between climate change and risks for nature and people now and into the future, the most effective way to act against the consequences of climate change on the vulnerable is to adapt. Now, how exactly will adaptation help lower the risk of climate change? Specifically, collective adaptation will do, although there are limits. We must recognize the interdependence of climate, ecosystems, biodiversity, and people. We must integrate natural, ecological, economic, and social sciences and provide new knowledge at regional levels, as well as opportunities for mitigation. This includes collaborating with indigenous people and locals to gain collective knowledge on the state and needs of their communities and ecosystems. And in doing so, we must emphasize the need for immediate action against climate risks because half measures are no longer an action. The fact is, climate change affects health, agriculture, economy, infrastructure, and ecosystems. When our atmosphere is doped with fossil fuels, there is a high vulnerability to climate change. All countries are affected. That is why adaptation becomes greater than mitigation, because we are at a state where mitigation is an action far too late to be done. Over the last decade, species are migrating in search for more livable conditions. In climate risks hotspots, death from floods, droughts, and storms are now 15 times higher than those in more resilient countries. These are only a few examples of climate injustice, particularly for indigenous people. Knowing the weight of this climate injustice, adaptation in the form of conservative ethics may be for the benefit of all living things. This is where Singer's environmental ethics comes in, which includes everyone and every living thing that walks, crawls, and touches the earth.
Now, let's talk about that. Tamang-tama, medyo maulan these days, so parang magandang pag-usapan yung environment. I guess also it would be interesting to know how the Western tradition views the natural world, how this topic is important for future generations, and is there really value beyond sentient beings? As mentioned earlier, Singer's environmental ethics includes everyone. Ikaw, ako, yung alaga nating hayop, lahat ng naglalakad, gumagapang, basically, lahat ng nandito sa mundo.
Wow, anong masasabi mo nakasama ka doon, ha?
Ngayon, kung sinasabi ni Singer na kailangang i-consider ang welfare ng lahat, especially ng future generations, paano kaya natin titignan ang situation na ito na isa-summarize natin sa question na, should the dam be built? Na natin. Dalawang set ng values ang maglalaban dito. Una, oo kasi para ito sa benefit ng mga tao. Flood control, more jobs, water supply, at iba pa. Pero ang pangalawa naman, hindi kasi maapektuhan ng matindi yung forest ecosystem kapag ginawa yung dam na ito. Yeah, I'll give you time and space para isipan, and we'll get back to that question during our live report.
Again, sa pananaw ni Singer,
all things on Earth is included in environmental ethics. Pero ano nga ba yung pananaw ng dominant Western tradition?
Medyo selfish dahil sabi nila, the natural world exists for the benefits of humans. Humans, tao, tayo na naman. Looking back at Aristotle's hierarchy regarding nature, sabi niya ang may pinakamataas daw na reasoning ability ang nasa ibabaw. At it is safe to assume na tayong mga tao yon, and we exist para sa mga ibang nandito sa mundo na mas mababa ang reasoning ability. Ilang yung mga tao ang importante sa mundo, destruction of nature can only be sinful kung maapektuhan tayong mga tao. Grabe, diba? Papaisip tayo syempre, diba? And I personally don't agree with the Western perspective. So, thank you to Singer for offering his insights regarding environmental ethics. Kung sarili lang ang iisipin natin, paano naman yung future generations? Future generations. Sa part na ito, importante kay Singer ang concept ng continuity. Once we decide to drown the forest as we build the dam, mapuputol ang ilang millions of years na history na ginawa ng ating mga ancestors. Oo, it will regrow, pero it will never be the same again. That's why it is very important to preserve nature and all wilderness in general na sobrang scarce na ngayon. Well, for Singer, this is not only for the purpose of nature providing us with resources, but also for aesthetic purposes. Aesthetic, usong-uso yan, di ba? Aesthetic room, aesthetic outfit. Now, I would like to leave you another scenario or question. It may be subjective, pero let's try. Sa ang situation ka mas mamamangha, alin kaya ang mas maganda para sa iyo? Finally, dream come true. Nakarating ka na sa Paris at nakita mo yung isa sa mga world-renowned paintings na hindi lahat nabibigyan ng pagkakataong makita. O yung nagbabakasyon ka sa isang lugar na known for its rich and beautiful environment. White sand beach, maraming puno, and everything else you can imagine. Hi there, Nemo. Now, is there value beyond sentient beings? With everything that has been mentioned, arbitrary ang sinabi ng Western tradition na tao lang ang may intrinsic value. A fundamental moral disagreement is that which beings are really to be considered when deliberating morally?
Reverence for life. Where do we find value once we stop valuing the interests of living things? What is good and what is bad for non-living things? Why does it matter? Probably the best known defense of an ethic that extends to all living things is that of Albert Schweitzer. The phrase, reverence for life, states that man's ethics must not be limited to himself but must encompass the entire universe. He must reconnect himself with the vast web of existence from which he cannot be detached. Reverence for life does not specify exact guidelines for every possible scenario. It just teaches us that we are in charge of our own life. It does not impose any upper or lower limitations on what we must do. At times, we must make judgment calls about which kinds of life and even which people we will spare and which we will eliminate. However, the idea of respect for life is universal. What should a poor farmer do when insects destroy his harvest, which is his sole source of income and allows him to sustain his family? Most of us know what to do in each case, yet life will be lost regardless of whatever option is chosen. Even if life can be lost, reverence for life states that it should never be surrendered ruthlessly or carelessly, and that an act may damage someone should only be carried out if the potential good outweighs the danger. Modern American philosopher Paul Taylor recently expressed a similar viewpoint. Taylor argues in his book Respect for Nature that every living thing is seeking its own benefit in its own unique manner. Once we realize this, we can perceive all living beings how we see ourselves, and so we are ready to respect their existence at the same level as our own. Deep ecology. The American ecologist 𝘬𝘪𝘭𝘰𝘸𝘚 proposed a land ethic that broadens the idea of community to include not just humans but also all other things on land. Care for people cannot be separated from care for the land. Direct interaction with nature, he argued, was essential in molding our ability to extend our ethics beyond our own self-interest. 𝘰𝘠 S, a Norwegian philosopher, distinguished between shallow and deep strands in the ecological movement. According to deep ecology, the living environment as a whole has the same right to flourish as humans. Shallow ecology, on the other hand, fixes short-term solutions to environmental problems. In an article written by 𝘰𝘠 S and George Sessions, participating in the deep ecology movement established principles for a deep ecological morality, including the well-being and flourishing of human and non-human life on Earth have value in themselves. These values are independent of the usefulness of the non-human world for human purposes. Richness and diversity of life forms contribute to the realization of these values and are also values in themselves. Humans have no right to reduce the richness and diversity except to satisfy vital needs. Although these principles only apply to living things, Hans and Sessions argue that deep ecology utilizes the word biosphere in a broader sense to include non-living entities like rivers, landscapes, and ecosystems. Richard Sylvan and Val Plumwood expanded ethics beyond living creatures, including a need to not imperil the well-being of natural objects or systems without good cause. Meanwhile, Lawrence Johnson pushed for a dramatic shift in our attitude toward the non-human world. He claims that non-human animals as well as ecosystems are morally relevant beings with rights and interests. Moreover, Freya Matthews argues that any self-realizing system has inherent worth since it tries to sustain or preserve itself. According to Matthews, we are connected to the one and all the other entities in it. These arguments are sufficient to demonstrate that, at least in a society where no one needs to destroy wilderness to obtain food or materials for shelter from the elements, the value of preserving the remaining significant areas of wilderness far outweighs the economic benefits gained from its destruction. Developing an environmental ethic. The issue is that ethical ideas evolve slowly, and we are running out of time to build a new environmental ethic. An environmental ethic would value resource conservation and recycle over excess and unneeded consumption. It's simple to see the broad outlines of a true environmental ethic. At its most basic level, such an ethic promotes regard for the interests of all sentient species, including future generations. It is complemented by valuing and respecting wild places and natural beauty. It discourages big families at the micro level, which is appropriate to the lifestyles of the people. The principles of a materialistic society, in which success is measured by the number of consumer things one may accumulate, are rejected by this environmental ethic. Instead, it measures success in terms of one's ability to develop and enrich through pleasure and contentment. The emphasis on simple living does not imply that an environmental ethic is anti-pleasure, but rather that the joys it cherishes are not obtained through excessive consumerism. Instead, they come from harmony with our environment rather than being harmful to it with due care as to not ruin what is valued. The future of environmental ethics. The area of environmental ethics is clearly here to stay, given the growing concern for the environment and the influence that our activities have on it. Environmental ethics has three possible futures. To begin with, improvements in political initiatives to alleviate environmental issues must and will inform environmental ethics. Environmental ethics is concerned with determining our moral responsibilities to the environment. After all, ethicists make statements about how they believe the world should be. As a result, the efficiency with which nations and governments get there will influence the forms of ethics that emerge. Second, corporations should take the initiative in addressing these issues. Given the power of customers, it may even be in large businesses' best interests to be involved in this. Corporate ethics must address many of the same challenges that environmental ethics has been addressing. Admittedly, the environment is not something one can remove oneself from. So, once environmental obligations are recognized, it will touch on other areas of ethics. Finally, our scientific understanding of the environment will absolutely inform environmental ethics. Whether it's changing our knowledge of how ecosystems operate or changes in the data around environmental issue, it's evident that these developments will inform and affect those writing about our environmental responsibilities. That is all for our report. Thank you for listening.